All right, here we are for another biology video. As you can see, this one is about photosynthesis, one of the most important processes on the planet that humans take for granted on a daily basis, and of course, a vital part of ecosystems. And so let's just get right to this idea of ecosystems. We've been comparing ecosystems for a while. So as you can see, I want you to answer these three questions. Why does the rainforest have such high biodiversity, deserts low, and forests medium amounts of biodiversity? Now, there's lots of reasons for this, and we've been talking about a lot of them over the last week. Basically, they're called limiting factors. Some things like biotic factors like food, or abiotic factors like sunlight and water. But those things are actually really closely related, because when you look at why does the rainforest have such high biodiversity, it has a lot of rain and a lot of sunlight and warm temperatures, whereas the desert has a lot of sunlight but very low rainfall and probably too hot of temperatures, whereas the forests sometimes have a lot of rain and a lot of sun, and other times not so much rain and not so much sunlight. Right? So rainfall and sunlight, as you can see, are the two that we're narrowing down on, because what does rainfall and sunlight have to do with? It has to do with food. It has to do with plants. It has to do with energy. It has to do with photosynthesis. The more energy that you have, the more life you are going to get, because living organisms use that energy to do something called maintain homeostasis, which basically just means stay alive. Right? This should make sense that you need energy to stay alive. All the energy on the planet comes from the sun, except for a little bit of energy that comes from inside the earth called geothermal energy. But all of the, all the ways that we power our daily lives, ultimately, the energy for that can be traced back to the sun. And so how does the sunlight power everything? How does the sunlight get into living things? That would be, again, by something called photosynthesis. So we need to understand photosynthesis to understand why ecosystems work the way they work, but also when will keep revisiting the ideas of photosynthesis as we talk about how our bodies work, because of course our bodies need energy, and you need plants. Because plants are the bottom of the food chain. I forgot that was going to come up. So here's a question to start us off with. What do you actually know about photosynthesis? People know the word. You might have some idea how it works, but do we really know? So here's the question. Where does the mass of a tree come from? Now, there aren't that many possible answers, but there's a few. And the most commonly given answer for this question that when I ask the students is that they say that it comes from the soil. And that makes a lot of sense if you think about it, right? We know that plants have to be planted in the soil and that they take stuff out of the soil. We know that, right? So what happens if we take a plant and we do a little experiment about it, right? Let's say these students plant a small plant in a pot. They weigh it before they put it into the pot. It weighs 1 kilogram at the beginning of the experiment. The soil in the pot weighs 5 kilograms, right? So there's that much soil in the pot. They let it grow until it's about 3 times as tall as when it started. There we go. And so then once it gets to about 3 times as tall, then they take the plant out and they weigh it, right? And so the plant weighs 3.5 kilograms at the end of the experiment. It gained 2.5 kilograms, right? There's that whole difference thing that we were working on before. So now my question to you is, if the plant gained 2.5 kilograms, how much should the soil weigh? What should be the mass of the soil, assuming that the plant is getting its matter, its mass from the soil? How much should the soil weigh? Now, after they weigh the plant, they weigh the soil, and it turns out that the soil still weighs 4.75 kilograms. The soil only went down by 0.25 kilograms, whereas the plant went up by 2.5 kilograms, right? That doesn't make sense. If the plant went up by 2.5, then the soil should have gone down by 2.5 kilograms. But it didn't, and it doesn't. And this is repeatable over and over and over because the plant is not actually getting its mass from the soil. And so that's interesting. And so then that usually sends students into this mad dash of, well, what if it's not the soil, then Where else would it come from? And the second choice of students is usually water, because we also know that plants need water. But there is a problem with that, is that plants are made out of sugar, basically. And sugar is made up of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygen atoms. Meanwhile, water is only made out of hydrogens and oxygens. How could the plant build itself out of sugar if the water doesn't have any carbon in it, right? There's no C right there, right? So the plant doesn't get its mass from the soil, and it also doesn't get its mass from the water. Now, where's the only other choice? It comes from the atmosphere. Yes, we need sunlight. Yes, we need water, but we need carbon dioxide. Plants are built out of air. And this is a very awesome idea. Again, if you need to build your body, what better place to get stuff than from the atmosphere, where all this carbon dioxide is just floating around waiting to be taken. So here we are with the overview of photosynthesis. We start with carbon dioxide and water and a bunch of light. And in the end, we come up with something called glucose, and it releases oxygen. Plants release oxygen. Maybe that's something that you know. And maybe it's something that you are under the impression that the whole reason why the plants are doing this is to make oxygen. We kind of talk about it that way sometimes, like, oh man, we're so thankful that plants make oxygen for us, which is true. But the plants aren't really making the oxygen for us. They're making the glucose for them. And the oxygen is a waste product. It's a byproduct. Glucose, which I'm going to represent by this shape, because the glucose kind of looks like a little hexagon when you look at its molecular structure, which we will do at some point. The glucose is the goal. Plants want to make glucose because glucose can be used for energy. My head's in the way. And it can be used to make other things, to use as raw materials to build themselves with, right? So plants need energy just like you do. They need to build their bodies just like you do. And they solve this problem by performing photosynthesis. So here is the most depth that you are going to be asked to talk about photosynthesis on, say, a lab or a quiz or a test. Over here on the left-hand side is a model of something called a chloroplast. Right? As you can see, it's labeled chloroplast right there. And there's a lot going on. The chloroplasts are these green things that are inside the leaves or any of the green parts of plants. And they're green because they have this stuff called chlorophyll. And the chlorophyll is green and it absorbs the light. Right? So we know that it starts with light coming in. And the light hits this part of the chloroplast that you don't need to know the name of, but it's called a thylakoid. But in any case, when the light hits that, the plant is going to produce something right here called ATP, which is the energy molecule. And in that process, water is going to be converted into oxygen. Right? So that's the first half of what we're going to talk about. We need ATP because ATP is actually the molecule that living things use to live. This is the only usable energy molecule on a moment-to-moment basis. So the goal here is to take sunlight and turn it into something called ATP, or convert the energy into ATP. We're not actually turning sunlight into anything. Now this diagram is a little complicated, but we're going to break it down one little piece at a time. Again, you have this, there it is. The light coming in from the sun hits this thing called the chlorophyll. Oh, my head. Oh, that works. The chlorophyll, that's this green thing right here. Now, during that, like I said, the water gets turned into oxygen. We're not too concerned with that right now because our goal is to make ATP. So light energy from the sun comes in and it makes electrons move. That's what this line right here is showing you. Electrons are moving. They're getting passed from molecule to molecule. The movement of those electrons is going to do something. Over here are some hydrogen ions, parts of atoms. And the hydrogens are going to get pushed across thanks to the energy of the electrons. And those hydrogens are going to help us to make ATP. So here's a model that I can make move a little bit, and maybe it might help a little. So over here on the left, we have the chlorophyll. and it has its electron up here with the E minus. Oh, I already labeled it. There we go. So here comes the photon, here comes the light, and the electron moves. And when the electron moves, it pushes these hydrogens across a barrier, across a membrane, across a cell membrane. This happens a bunch of times. Every time the light hits the chlorophyll, the electron moves and it pushes these hydrogens. Now the electrons actually have a lot of energy in them, and we're going to take them and use them later. Those are going to fly off to go be used at a different point. But now we have this interesting situation where we moved the hydrogens on purpose, because the hydrogens are stuck inside of this little area inside the thylakoid, and they want to get out, and the only way out is through a tunnel called ATP synthase. And so if they flow back out the other way, and it makes this stuff called ATP. So the electrons are moving because of the light, and the electrons push these hydrogens around, and the hydrogens eventually give us these things called ATP, right? And the ATP we can then use to do things. Now here's a little better image of this enzyme called ATP synthase. This is a type of molecule called a protein, which is a molecule that your body builds based on DNA. So this one is technically for mitochondria, but you don't have the one for photosynthesis. But everybody has a bunch of these molecules in their cells. This is how your cells make ATP. And so your DNA has the instructions on how to build this crazy spinning windmill-looking machine that is embedded into, in this case, again, to the chloroplast, but you have similar ones inside of you, which we'll talk about at a later time. So at the end of all this, I'm going to skip through this part real fast. You don't need to know that. At the end of all this, we have made a bunch of ATP. Thanks to the electrons, we've also made a bunch of water. So at this point, you should know that light and water come in, and I think I just misspoke, and oxygen comes out, as well as these things called ATP, right, which we are about to talk about. So as long as the sun is shining, we can keep making ATP. Now, the sun doesn't always shine, and that's an interesting thing. And what does this have to do with bugs? These bugs are called aphids. Aphids generally live on in your garden. They eat leaves of plants. Most aphids look like this. But not too long ago, scientists discovered some aphids that were green, like the ones on the left. And that was interesting because most of these bugs are not green, and why would they be green? And so somebody thought, well, maybe they're green because they have chlorophyll in them. And so the scientists did an interesting and maybe a little bit of a mean experiment. They took all these aphids and they basically blended them up to make this green goop. And then they took that goop and they shined a light on it. And it turns out that when they shined the light on the goop, the molecules started to do photosynthesis. They started to produce ATP just the same way that plants would do. But the plants and these aphids have a problem, that as soon as the sun goes away, then the ATP stops. And so these bugs still need to eat because they want to live through the night, right? Like that would be important. And so plants need to live through the night as well. And so both, again, the aphids and the plants have the same problem, that they need energy when there's no sunlight. So instead of using the ATP that you make immediately from the sunlight, you're going to take that and you're going to build something else with it. In this case, you're going to build glucose or sugars, right? So here comes some carbon dioxide. It gets taken in by the plant and it does a bunch of steps, lots and lots of steps. This, even though this diagram that we're looking at is kind of complicated, it's nothing compared to the real amount of steps that go on during this process. But the point is that we're going to take the carbons and we're going to start sticking them together in groups of 3 at first, and then eventually into groups of 6. And the groups of 6 represent sugar. This is going to require a bunch of energy. And these parts, if you remember from what I said before, these are the electrons, right? So in comes carbon dioxide, using the energy from that ATP that we made before from the sunlight and the electrons that we stole thanks to the sunlight. We're going to make our final product of sugar, right? And so the sugar, the glucose, can be used directly for energy. So once the plant makes the glucose, it could then convert the glucose back into ATP if it needed to. But a lot of time it's going to be stored in something called starch, which is potatoes and wheat and rice and corn. These are plants that have a lot of starch in them. In fact, humans have bred these plants to have the most amount of starch they can get it to have. And of course, bread is made from wheat. And then sometimes the plant would, instead of storing that as starch, would use it to build itself using making a molecule called cellulose, which cellulose for us mostly means leaves. But the plants can also take the cellulose and turn it into just plain old wood, right? And so photosynthesis is going to harness sunlight, and that sunlight is then going to go towards either feeding the plant or eventually feeding us or any other animal that was going to eat that plant, right? And this is going to keep the ecosystem flowing. The energy is going to come in from the sun. The plants are going to take it in as the bottom of the food chain, and then everything else can follow from the plants, right? And so this is, of course, just the beginning part about photosynthesis. Eventually, we will get to these other steps of how does the energy and the matter move around through the ecosystem. But in the end, this is what you would need to really be able to say. What goes in, these are sometimes called reactants or inputs, and then what comes out, these are called the products or outputs, right? Of course, the light is a very important part to make it all happen. So in the end, hopefully that makes sense, and we'll talk about this more in class.